what I've done instead is to centre this around what I've called 5 myths, common myths about the SNP. I'll come back to why there's an asterisk there in a while, but because myths, the line that goes from myths to over-exaggerations to simplifications to absolute truth, it's hard to say where some of these fall. But the first one that I'm going to talk about is the idea that's sometimes mentioned. You've heard people talk with bafflement after the referendum. How is it that the losers are behaving like winners and the winners are behaving like losers? It's because the SNP certainly can't be really said to have lost the referendum. Number one, they won the referendum campaign hands down. The referendum was characterised by a staggering number of minds made up long before the vote. But among the relatively few who didn't have their minds made up, yes, stroke the SNP won a very clear majority, which is how they got so close to winning the referendum itself. And I said yes, stroke the SNP, to indicate there is in fact a difference between those two. Clearly an overlap, but there is a difference. And that difference is important politically, and that brings me to the next myth, which is that a lot of people have noticed that the SNP got 45% of the vote in their breakthrough election in 2011, where they won the majority in the Scottish Parliament. Yes won 45% in the referendum, and the SNP is now polling at around 45% in Westminster vote intention polls in Scotland. Now clearly there is going to be a lot of overlap between those 45%, but they are not the same people. Partly that's because there are some people who support independence who won't vote SNP, but mainly it's because there are people who have always been willing to vote, or for at least for a long time, been willing to vote for the SNP despite not supporting that flagship policy of independence. And the big reason for that, the clue, is in the party's own constitution, which sets out at the outset 2 main aims for the SNP. One, the pursuit of independence. The second, the furtherance of Scottish interests more generally, regardless of the constitutional position. And whether you interpret that in terms of constitutional specifics, that the SNP is the route to more devolution, or whether you just interpret it as a general willingness to stand up for Westminster, the SNP has long had very strong credentials in Scottish public opinion in that respect. And that's a handy thing to have, because the great thing about Scottish interests is there aren't really many people in Scotland who aren't strongly in favour of pursuing Scottish interests. And that's why the SNP, when it makes gains, as it did in 2011 and as it will do in 2015, it gets them from across the board. It doesn't tend to get them from particular constituencies, be they political or social or demographic. And there's a figure in the briefing that I provided for this, which shows that support, the SNP gains, are coming from across the partisan board, with the exception of the Conservatives. And that's why 2015 and 2011 are looking similar in terms of the electoral map that they draw, because the SNP will again gain a lot of support from across the board. In the referendum, there was much play made, and rightly, of the fact that the swing to yes came predominantly in Labour areas. And that's, to some extent, going to be true this time around. So it's going to be true mainly because if you make the round across the board in Scotland, you take seats disproportionately from Labour, because that's basically all there is. There's a few Lib Dems, and the SNP look poised to unseat them as well. But any major gain that is taken from across the partisan board in Scotland is very bad news for Labour, and bad news for the Lib Dems, and irrelevant for the Conservatives, because they don't have anybody there in the first place. Labour suffers disproportionately, or at least Labour had more to lose, exactly because it used to have stronger Scottish interests credentials than it does now, and there's a variety of reasons for that, which I can talk about, but we don't need to go into it now. Related myth, this is the one that's probably closest to being an overstatement rather than a myth, is that the SNP is a working class left-wing party. The across-the-board point holds here. The SNP wins support from across the socio-demographic board, and in 2011 it was remarkably homogenous in terms of its sources of support. That has changed somewhat, and there's no doubt the referendum has meant that the SNP has made disproportionate gains among the kinds of traditional Labour groups, and that has given it something of a profile in that it's made it a little more of a clearly working class party, and it does do slightly better among working class voters and noticeably better among what you might call the most working class voters. But nonetheless, still pretty homogeneous. I'm not sure how to pronounce that, so I've used both forms. Is support, and that's exactly because a party that appeals on Scottish interests will win support from across the board. And when it comes to the left-wingness, the SNP definitely presents itself as left-wing, but there's a distinction between the SNP as a contender for Westminster and as an operator on the UK scene, where it needs to be left-wing because left-wingness has become associated with Scottish interests and Scottish identity. On the domestic scene, those who study the SNP in government have come to the conclusion, there's one article about this that this title is From Social Democracy to No Ideology, reflecting the fact that the SNP as a government operator isn't particularly left-wing at all. And you definitely get the sense, and not least because of course a party based on Scottish interest will have candidates and leaders from across the spectrum as well as voters, that they're kind of left-wing insofar as they need to be, because that's what you need to be the Scottish National Party, rather than that being their driving motivation. In other words, in a sense, the left-wingness is for the domestic audience. Which leads to the next myth, because the SNP, what the SNP does after May the 7th will be catering again absolutely for the domestic audience. What they're interested in is not particularly who's in government at Westminster, but what they can get out of that government. And they would take it from the Tories if they could, but they can't because the domestic audience will rebel against anything that looks like supporting the Conservatives. Don't overstate that though either, because the Labour Party in Scotland is less and less popular, and support for either is becoming more difficult. And so while it may be true, I was trying to assess whether Nicola Sturgeon was telling the truth, even supposing that she did say to the French ambassador or whoever it was that she secretly wants the Conservatives to win. But I would say that it doesn't matter that much to the SNP who wins at Westminster. Their strategy will be pretty similar. And an kind of understudied reason why the SNP won't care that much who wins in 2015 is that they don't care that much what happens at Westminster anyway. And it's an easy mistake to make, and some of the more outlandish, what you might call English nationalists, who seem to view the SNP as a sinister plot to inflict Scottish policies on England. It's not really like that. They've never shown that much interest. As soon as the Scottish Parliament was formed, nearly all the SNP MPs decamped to join the Scottish Parliament. That's where the SNP talent goes, with all due respect to Alex Salmond. It's a place where they can govern, and that's what they're interested in doing. But this election provides an opportunity to cater for the, to play to the domestic audience and to get more powers for Scotland. And finally, I doubt many people here believe this, because it's been clear for a long time that the SNP was playing a very long game in terms of independence. And they were jolted out of that long game by winning the majority in 2011, which forced them to have the referendum, which they definitely didn't want to have that soon. They're driven very strongly by public opinion on this, which is why they were mad keen on having a more powers option on the 2014 referendum ballot, because they thought they would win that. They were pleasantly surprised by how close they got in 2014, but partly because that referendum is so recent, they don't detect any public appetite for a referendum in the near future, and they won't want one until public opinion is clearly and unambiguously in favour of independence, which doesn't look imminent. And even if there's a referendum on the European Union, that might shift public opinion, but that will be the shift that needs to happen before the SNP start wanting a referendum. And at the moment, anything an SNP politician says in response to a question about the referendum, you need to pay more attention to who's asking the question and their motivations, because it's usually because they want the SNP to look like a party that's hell-bent on independence ASAP, when in fact they're not, they're playing a longer game. So there's the caveat. Some of these come closer to exaggerations than myths, but they can all come under that broadly misconception heading.